We're talking today about plants whose way of life is sort of being burnt alive. Pretty scary fires. And here's just to hammer home that point again. Here's some other news stories about fires. And so here, even in BC, well, we get a lot of fires too. And this is in Spain. This is a tourist resort, Marbella. I think it's a pretty cool picture. A huge fire on the hill just outside. So, and 150,000 acres in the west of America. So yeah, generally that's how we hear about them, when they're getting near our towns and cities, and we're fighting them. And as you can see here, this is what us animals, people, animals and other animals do, is they sort of run away. So I've got a picture of that here. Yeah, so you have to be pretty quick to run again. This is Mo Farah, the 10,000 meter runner. But for plants, they can't run away. So we're talking today about this acacia tree behind. So it sort of has it's locked to the ground. So if you could imagine for a second that you have your feet in concrete boots, and you know there's going to be a fire eventually happen, like you're locked in the interior of BC somewhere. And then just, can anyone think of maybe a suggestion for how you might try and survive that fire? Yeah?
Cover yourself in water.
Cover yourself in water. So like try and protect yourself somehow, right? Yeah, that's a good answer. Anyone else got any ideas? Yeah?
Call 911.
Call 911. Yeah, get the fire brigade. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah?
Fight against it with water.
Well, you mean like spray water out?
Yeah.
So you know that plants, they're actually, like, water's quite precious for plants. They generally can't, and also they don't have fire hoses or emergency services. Maybe just think, so you're locked in with concrete boots. Where on your body, if you're up to here in concrete, might be safe from the fire? Yeah. I'll just try something else.
Like in a tree's case, the part underground, so its roots.
Right, or like, yeah, or in the example, like your boots. Good. So we had sort of two answers. One, like protect yourself. I was thinking of maybe like buy a fireman's jacket to protect yourself from the fire. And the other one was you can hide underground or use your underground parts, exactly like the roots. Now we're going to move on to the plants. Does anyone recognize this? Yeah? Sorry. You know what?
Cork.
It's a cork, right. So, a little alcoholic. I'm really joking. So yeah, it's a cork. And corks actually come from trees. They're a bit like plants' fireman's jacket. So here is a cork tree in southern Spain, where I did some research. And this is the outer covering, which is what this is made of. And it's been harvested, leaving the bare trunk. This is a cross-section through a cork tree. So the cork is sort of bored through the outer casing like that. And yeah, so there you can see. So this is like protecting it from a fire if a fire comes past. And then it has energy reserves specially built up for after the fire, which it stores in the middle in these organs here. And then it's able to just resprout. So this is the cork tree again, and this is the burnt branches behind. And this is like 2 years after a fire. And from this little part here, inside the trunk, it's been protected by the cork, and then been able to resprout out like that. Does anyone know what stem cells are? Does anyone heard of stem cells in the news? No? Yeah? So so a few people know. So it's maybe, so generally the way it's described is, it's a type of cell which can turn into any other different type of cell. Like, so for example, your skin cells could never just instantly turn into your liver, whereas the stem cells are able to just turn into all the different types of cell. And plants grow with their type of stem cells at the top of the shoot as it grows up. And then that divides and turns into all the different sort of, like the skin and the internal organs of the tree as it's growing. And they can also leave little stem cells behind which then, let's say when you're chopping off a rose, it regrows from just below, right? That's because it's got some stem cells, which you chop off the top, but it's still able to grow from there. So these cork trees have some of these sort of stem cells inside. They're just called buds. So there you go. So that's our first strategy for surviving a fire, which is resprouting. Sorry, this is another example. The first one was cork. This is a eucalyptus species. And you can see there, really burnt, thick bark, and it's sprouting out from it there. So I'm going to write that down. There's many ways you can divide the strategies for surviving fire, but this is the way I'm doing it. So we start with resprouting. Sprout means when you grow back out like that. And from the trunk. So I'm going to categorize that as above ground resprouting. Okay? So that's like the fireman's jacket. But some plants basically can't afford a fireman's jacket. So they choose the other option, which is growing from the roots, like you said. So this is an example of that. They've put their storage in this sort of, it's a bit like, imagine a potato underground. There's they store energy like that underground. And then they're able to resprout back out after the fire. Look, so it's all been burnt. This is camise, it's a Californian species. And it's just resprouting from the root crown here, which is where it's stored its energy. And I've got another example. This is 2 years after the fire. This is actually that cork tree that I just showed you before, resprouting. And these are ericas, which is heath. Actually, on the way here this morning, I saw one, so I picked it up. You can come and look at these later. And yeah, so they store energy underground and resprout like this. So I think this picture's quite impressive because it's only been 2 years after the fire, and look at how much green there is around. Look, I think that's quite amazing. And sorry, I should just write down the other part. So above ground and below ground, that was like those potato-like structures that we saw underground. Okay, but how do you think all these other plants came up in only 2 years after the fire? So not the erica, not the cork, but all these other plants you can see growing. Yep.
Maybe the seeds drifted in through the air.
So that would be like, so the one area burns, and then seeds from outside arrive after the fire, right?
Because they're smaller plants, so they would be able to grow that much quicker.
Yeah, they've grown that quickly, right? But that's a really good answer. But actually what's happened is that there was seeds there before the fire. They didn't have to come in. They were just there, and then because, I mean, you've seen seeds, right? Like a cherry seed from the inside of cherry or apple seeds. And so it's easy to give them a thick coat, which then is able to survive the fire. And then they germinate up afterwards. So there's loads of seeds in this environment, which are actually just waiting for a fire to happen, and then they'll germinate at once. I'm going to call this strategy seeding, or seeder. Some people call it reseeder. So we see some examples. This is cistus, popular garden plant, and if you treat the seeds of this cistus rock rose with some smoke water, like bubble some smoke through some water, so it has chemicals from smoke in it, then it'll germinate much better than if you just put the seeds on the ground. I.e., the germination is actually triggered by the smoke. Germination is just when you have the seed and then it starts growing into a plant. So that's triggered by smoke. And this next example, this is another garden plant. You'll see it. There's one by the bus loop that maybe might see. And so it's sugar bush. It's quite a popular garden plant. And gardeners realized that if they put the seeds in like a bag and then put the bag in boiling water, that instead of maybe 1 seed out of 10 germinating, they get maybe 8 or 9 germinating, basically 100%. So what these plants are doing is they have their seeds in the soil, but then they wait until the fire happens before trying to grow up and reproduce. So that's quite an interesting strategy. And what I'm doing in my first chapter of my PhD is sort of like some theoretical work on why plants do that strategy. So anyway, that's just what I'm doing. So yeah, smoke and heat triggered germination because yeah, so basically they sort of grow up after fire. Well, can anyone think of any ideas why you might want to wait until there's a fire and then start growing? Do my PhD for me? Yeah.
So it's safer?
Safer? Why would it be?
To grow up because there's less chance of fire.
Right.
Here for a while.
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat this so everyone hears. So, sorry, what's your name? Olympia said that there's less chance of there being a fire right after another fire because there's nothing there to burn again, right? So that's a good reason why there's fires are sort of like structured in time, that's sort of regular. And so if you germinate right after the fire, you're less likely to immediately die, so you've got a better chance of surviving. That's really good. And, oh yeah, another reason.
Wouldn't there be less competition?
Exactly, so that's another good reason and also there's actually ash on the ground from the fire, which is nice sort of plant food for them to grow. So yeah, you guys have written my PhD, so congratulations. I'm just going to show you one other example. This is what, this is a plant which has a bit of, we think it has smoke-induced germination. And this is what I worked on when I was doing fieldwork in Spain. It's a really special plant. I really like this plant because, well, I just think it looks great. But also, it's the only plant in its family. So that means it's special because, like humans, for example, we're quite special. We're the only plant in our genus. There are no like Neanderthals or things very similar to us. But there are like apes and other monkeys, or apes and monkeys, which are in our family. But this is the only one in its family, so it's really special. And also, it's carnivorous. It eats insects. See, this is it growing. It grows, and then this leaf will unfurl. And these are sticky, sticky pads. And you can see here it's called this. I think it's a bee. It might be like a mimic. I'm not actually sure. Sorry, is my question? Yeah, and then it'll sort of digest it like you do in your stomach, and eat that and use that for nutrients to grow. And yeah, another reason why this is a great plant is that it's the only carnivorous plant that grows in dry environments. So it's a really special plant. And it does this smoke-induced germination, we think. Okay, so back to the topic. One more strategy that we're going to look at for getting past the fire. It's not only a way, you don't just get your seeds in by just leaving them in the ground, like those plants we just looked at. You can also release them. So this is lodgepole pine, which grows in BC. You probably know it. And usually the cones, like this, are sort of held shut with a resin. And then when a fire sweeps through the forest, it melts the resin, and then the cone sort of quite slowly opens up, and the seeds are inside the cone here, and then they'll drop down onto that post. Yeah?
Won't the entire pine cone just sort of burn, like the entire thing, as opposed to just the resin?
Right, so you can see the edges of this one here. This is after a fire, so you can see all the background's been burnt. And so it was like this, and then it's been burnt, so all the edges have been sort of burnt. But because it's quite thick, strong bark, it's not just like completely, I mean, look, you can still, the branch here is still there, it's just dead, it's been charred on the outside. And you can see, look, the middle's been protected, that's not all black, because that's then opened up after the fire, and it dropped the seeds out. So that's how, so this is a cool picture of after a fire. These are lodgepole pines, nice for making your ski lodge with, nice straight lodges. And then these are the saplings that have grown up. Apparently this is 10 years after a fire. They've grown up like that. So that's how they do it. They sort of survive the fire through their kids. So this is our last strategy, which is, let's say, seeds from pods. That's not a very good description, but just try and remember that that's when the pods open up, when they're burnt. One more of those. This is a cooler one. It's not in BC, unfortunately. It's an Australian species called Banksia. We have some specimens down here. And this is its flowers. So there's lots of little flowers here. And hopefully you guys know that so the male and female parts will grow out of these flowers. It's not quite opened up, this one. And then, so either wind or bees will carry the pollen from one flower to another, and then it will make seeds. Yeah, is there a question? Oh no, you're just stretching. So, yeah, so they'll make seeds after the flowers got pollen from another flower. And then, so actually only a few of the flowers have turned into seed pods. These are other dead ones that have just been left behind. And these, again, these kind of weird clam-like seed pods are held shut with a resin, which melts in the fire. And then here's a picture of it opened up, like little mouths. And these little tongue things are actually the seeds from that seed pod. And apparently, in the fire, the hot air, these are quite sort of light and thin, they'll fly off, and so they'll also disperse really fast. So that's like a super big adaptation to fire. They're using it for their dispersal as well as, they're using it for getting, to new places, as well as, as we said, reproducing after fire, sort of surviving it that way. So yeah, like that's the main strategies I was going to talk about. But there's a couple of other cool ones, which is sort of a little bit rarer or more unusual. Firstly, this is the grass tree, another Australian species, and it grows like a palm does. So it's not actually a grass, but the leaves look a little bit like a grass. You can see them here, and they grow out, and then when they die, that forms the sort of trunk for the next one. That's like how a palm is. You can see the you can see the dead leaves from before sticking out. And so it grows up a trunk like that and turns into a tree. And then, as you can see, there's been a fire here, and that has triggered these grass trees to start flowering. So what you can see here, these cool-looking spikes, that's flowers that have grown up out of the middle of the grass tree. And so, as we just discussed, flowers then produce the seeds. So they're sort of also reproducing after the fire. But you can sort of see that they are messing up my system here, because they're like both surviving the fire and reproducing after the fire. So we'll just sort of put them in the middle somewhere, and I'll call that post-fire flowering. Okay. And then finally, a few cool suggestions people have come up with for other adaptations for fires. This is an acacia seed being carried off by an ant. And this little thing on the end that it's carrying is a little fatty body, which is especially for the ant. So the ant will then carry it underground, which, as we just said, is sort of like quite a nice place to survive the fire for this seed, and a good place to then germinate after. So some people think that this is sort of one of those adaptations, ways of getting through fires. And there's some evidence for that. For example, in South Africa, where there's a lot of fires, a lot of species, plant species have their seeds carried around by ants. So perhaps that's one. This is another one, another idea that people have come up with. I think it's got this kind of a catchy title. This idea is "Kill Thy Neighbor," and the idea is that plants, lots of these plants that live in fire fire-prone habitats have resins which catch fire very easily, or they seem to have bark still hanging off them. And so maybe if you're a plant that does really well in fire conditions, you actually make it more likely to burn in order that you'll then do less well, like your children will do really well in that regularly burning environment. Like I said, the second part we're going to talk about conservation. So hopefully everyone's heard of conservation. It's in the news a lot. And actually sometimes newspapers like to write about fire conservation because it's sort of interesting. So I was hoping maybe you guys would be interested in hearing about it a little bit. And basically the idea is if you have all these plants, by the way, there's actually quite a lot of plants with these strategies. I only showed a few, but like, let's say, why don't I make you guess? So from these 4 strategies, the above ground resprouting, like this, like the cork, or below ground, like the heath, the ericas.
You mean 7?
Sorry?
You mean 7 of them?
Oh, I'm just going to do these 4. They're the main ones. Okay. And then this, where they germinate after they've had some smoke or some heat on them, and then the seeds where they've opened up after the fire. Which one of those 4 do you think is the most common? Okay, let's do hands up for above ground sprouting. Nobody thinks that. What about the below ground where they come back up? Yeah, quite a few. What about where smoke or heat increases their chance of germination, like those ones? Okay, not many, but a few people think that. And what about the ones like the lodgepole pine where the cones open up? So actually, if anyone said there's smoke and heat germination, that's really common. There's probably about 2,500 species at least that have at least increased their germination rate if you treat them with smoke, and probably loads more with heat too. I'm not sure about exact numbers on the other ones, but they're less common than that. So yeah, so there's actually a lot of plants which are in some way adapted. They some way they make their living with related to fires. So there's this idea that perhaps we need to basically burn plants in order to protect them. Because if you're a plant which makes its living, its adaptation is to fires, then you're going to need the fires in order to survive into the future. So that was sort of quite a new idea. Like I said, we started off with that quite scary video of the fire, and that's how people thought of fires for many years and just thought of them in terms of a human. But relatively recently, maybe like 20 or 30 years ago, there's been a big change, and people have started to realize that plants depend on these fire events. So I'm going to start off in northern BC, and this is in the boreal forest. This is a photo by Jill Johnson, who also works in the department. And this boreal forest is mostly the lodgepole pine, which you already met. That has its cones only open up after the fire. And also white spruce and black spruce. I think it's the black spruce does a bit of the cones opening after fire, but they also sort of open naturally a bit, so they're sort of half and half strategy. And I think it's the other one, the white spruce. I sometimes get those mixed up. That just opens them up regularly all the time. So anyway, so the composition of these boreal forests in BC is, like, which plants are there, really depends a lot on the fires that are happening, as you could tell just from that description of the 3 main species. And so here in the background, there's been a big fire. And I just want to show a picture of what can happen to a boreal forest if the fire frequency is wrong. So, or bad for the forest. This used to all be forest, like that last picture. And now, obviously, there's no trees and they're not coming back. So the fires were too regular. And that, I think, changed the soil depth. And that has led to it becoming like this, like just meadows. I think this is in northern Saskatchewan or somewhere like that. Yeah, so that's what can happen if the fire frequency is wrong. So that's the reason I'm showing you that. Now we're going to look at an example of another fire-adapted species, and it's sort of a nice conservation story. So this is the Longleaf pine. So another pine tree, and it's kind of weird. It starts off, it's called the grass stage. These are actually all young pine trees. And so obviously they look a little bit like grass. And they've got these long leaves. That's why it's called the longleaf pine. It grows in Florida and Georgia. And it'll stay like this, building up reserves of energy for maybe 6 to 10 years. And then maybe after 10 years, or maybe if there's a fire, it'll be triggered to then grow really quickly. So in that next year, when it decides to grow, it can grow from obviously this high, like a grass, up to a couple of meters, which is out of the range of lots of the fires that happen in this ecosystem. So this part of the world. And so basically, you can see just from that description, it's a plant that's adapted to fires. So people, and it was, the range was really decreasing for this. It was disappearing a little bit from East America. And so they realized that in order to protect it, they'd have to keep these fires going. What was happening was other species, which are faster growing and don't do this weird strategy where they wait down, were just crowding them out, and so that the forests were changing. So now people set fires, and it spreads through and creates this nice open field, which you get these nice big pine trees in. You can imagine these pine trees. I said they were, getting smaller and smaller areas. Well, this is a whole type of landscape that you wouldn't get if those pine trees weren't there. And so by saving the pine trees, you also save animals like this. It's called a gopher tortoise. It's quite famous. It's actually literally a textbook example of I think it's a vulnerable species, which is called Keystone species. So Keystone is in a bridge. The very top stone is the one you put in last, and then you can take all the scaffolding and stuff away, and it'll stay up because the keystone is the bridge is trying to fall this way and that way, and the keystone is keeping it in place. So basically, the idea is keystone species are really important for all the other species in the area. So, for example, this gopher tortoise. There's been 300 and I think people think that there's 350 species which depend on the gopher tortoise burrows and gopher tortoise in order to survive. So, like, if you're a snake, maybe you can't run away as fast as Mo Farah in that picture. So you go down one of these gopher tortoise burrows. So that's just another sort of interesting. There's a little bit of an aside, but something about conservation where lots of the species are interconnected. And I just think that this, what we can learn from this longleaf pine story is a little bit about keystone species. And also, it's a good example because you're able to rescue this, this habitat, this type of environment, and also all the species that go with it. And it's also good for humans because you can use these pine logs are obviously commercially viable. So by understanding the fire and saving the habitat, we're also doing a good thing for humans. So that's actually a relatively unusual example of that, but a nice example. Okay, another fire-adapted species, which is managed by fire in order to protect it. So this idea of burning things in order to protect them. Does anyone know what this is? Not this animal, the plant behind it.
Tree.
It's a tree. Do you know what type of tree it is?
No.
No? Any guesses? I think I heard it from... Yeah, I think I heard it just here. A redwood. Right. So has anyone been down to California? You can go see these redwoods. And these are the tallest trees in the world. Does anyone want to guess how tall this tree is?
1 trillion feet.
1 trillion feet. It's less than 1 trillion feet. Yeah?
200 feet.
200 feet? It's more than 200 feet?
165 feet.
Actually, this isn't the very tallest tree in the world. This is 350 feet, about. So 350 feet is over 100 meters, which is like over, like you could, if you put it in downtown Vancouver, it would be on maybe the 35th or 40th floor so taller than most of the skyscrapers in Vancouver. About 2/3 the height of the Space Needle, if anyone's been down to Seattle.
I know.
You've been down?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty high, right? You can imagine looking off the side, and then just below you is the top of a big tree waving around. So, anyway, so I just thought that was quite cool, but the reason I mentioned it is because they've started managing their redwood forests with they're allowing fires to happen in order to protect them. And the reason for that is that the redwood puts some of its energy into a thicker bark, like a thicker fireman's jacket, as we were talking about earlier. And that means it grows a little bit slower. So another species, like one of the spruces, would grow faster than it, but be less good at surviving a fire if it comes along. So basically, without fire, young redwoods are outcompeted by other trees. Now you might be thinking, yeah, but this tree, there's no way anything can outcompete this tree. But the interesting thing is, if all these young trees around were replaced by spruces, they wouldn't be tall enough to protect the big redwoods from the wind. So if you want to save like a big 350-foot redwood, you also have to allow some of the area around to burn. And this is a burn scar from a fire which has passed through the habitat. And this is the inside of a huge redwood with, you can see the burning inside. But it's survived and it's still growing. That's why it's not black on the outside. So there you go. So I'll just say again, yeah, so people have realized, I mean relatively recently, that sometimes if they want to save these species, like this really cool massive trees, or that really cool tortoise or whatever, then they have to manage these fires. And now I'm just going to mention the project I worked on when I was in Spain, which was back to this, my favorite plant, the carnivorous one, the one that eats the insects. And what we did, so it grows only on the top of what they call mountains. They're not actually that high compared to our mountains here, but you know, I had to hike up and it was pretty tough. And then we walked around looking for them, literally just wandering around the top of a mountain. So they only grow in southern Spain, and they only grow on the top of mountains and only sandstone parts of the top of those mountains. And like I said, they're really special, so they're, we want to save these species. So that's why we were going looking for them. And then sometimes it actually turns out to be an army base, and you have to discuss with the army about what you're doing, and they look a little bit nonplussed as to why the hell you want to find these plants. And then you put down, you measure an area, and you go and find all the plants which are in that area, tag them all with a little child's toy for label making. So it's real like high-tech science. And yeah, as you can see, we're on top of a mountain here. And then you come back. People will be going back every... Oh, yeah, there's the label maker. There's my label maker. So yeah, as you can see, no expense spared. It's some kids. Actually, it was funny. We went back for so many labels. The woman in the shop said, "Wow, your kids really love labeling stuff." Like they thought we would label like everything in the house was. So anyway, so you go and you can measure these plants, and there's various different times after the fire, and the aim is to this is let's say this is another plant that somebody else has done, and 2 to 6 years after a fire, or 9 to 14, or over 20, and then they've measured how many there are and how many survive, and using this you make a model, and then you can think of a strategy for how to save this rare species. So it's a lot of work, but yeah, there you go. That's one thing you can do conservationally. Right, so there's a few examples, but you might say to me like, yeah, Mike, yeah, I love the gopher tortoise. I love your plant. You know, you can shut up about it now. And but like, how really important is this? I mean, and you know, we can't pay you to go out and save every single species by going out with your little child's toy. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. So basically it's very important to manage fires on a global scale. So these are 5 regions which all have, you can see they're all in similar latitude, they're all about the same distance from the equator. And they're all places where there's lots of fires. So you get lots of plants adapted to fires in these places. And they're all extremely biodiverse. That means there's lots of species there. And so they've been identified as places which we should protect because there's only 1% of the land area, but maybe 15% of the plant species in the whole world. And so you want to save them because you never know which of those thousands and thousands of species, maybe one of them has like a important drug in it or some genes which will be important for saving all our crops and our food supply. And so on that kind of scale, thousands of plants, it's quite a tough task to get the fire levels right in order to save them all. And especially, you might have noticed that these are quite populated areas. They're around humans. So fires, as we saw right at the beginning, what people tend to do is just put them out, send out the fire brigade. So there was this quite exciting time, maybe 10 years ago, when people were learning all this stuff about fires and how plants survive fires. And we thought that every case could be really nice, like that lodgepole pine place, where thing is great for the plants and great for the humans. So, like in this case, we'd be regularly burning these areas, and we would never get wood building up to a high level, and we would never get those really massive fires, like that 150,000 acre fire in California. So that was really nice, and there's something to that. But if you think about it, if you were president of the whole entire world, it's quite difficult to decide what to do. Like maybe you just burn each area once every 10 years or once every 5 years. But then, that could be good for my plant, that carnivorous plant, but it might not be good for all of those other thousands of plants. So I'm just going to finish by saying maybe we should be going for a strategy of mixture of fire frequencies, like once every 5 years, once every 10 years, once every 20 years, and sometimes much longer. And also mixture of intensities, how big each fire is. And so that sometimes means it's likely that some of these plants need those really massive, really scary fires. And this idea has been called bet hedging. This is like a roulette table for the gamblers. And you just throw your chips all over, so you have lots of different fire frequencies and intensities. And you're sort of betting on all of them and trying to save those species. Because, we can't afford to pay me to go out and use my kid's toy on all of them. So, that's the end. And I'd love to take questions. And thanks everyone for coming down on Sunday. It's great.